Hello, astute researchers, and welcome to Research Methods 290. This is our first video. Think back to when you first heard about COVID. There are lots of questions. People had all kinds of questions. We had to know things. What happens? How long does it last? How fatal is it? What do we need to do? All kinds of things that we wanted to know about COVID that would help us figure out how to handle it. Other people asked questions about COVID and trauma. What about the people who are treating COVID? So one question asked was, do nurses on the front lines experience more trauma because of COVID? Well, what do you think? What would you guess? Would nurses on the front lines be more likely to have trauma or less likely to have trauma? This is a great example of a scientific question. And so people asked that question, they collected data to figure it out, and they found the answer. And the answer is no. The people on the front lines actually, who are not on the front lines, sorry, the people not on the front lines actually had more trauma than the people on the front lines, which seems maybe not what you would have guessed. This is why the scientific method is so valuable. You can find out answers that are based in data and not based on guesses. And so if you left it up to guesswork, you might think that it just makes sense. Of course, people on the front lines are more traumatized. It turns out they're not. More imagining versus reality is what was happening. So the people who are not on the front lines let their imaginations maybe run wild. And the people who were on the front lines saw exactly what was happening and they could deal with it much better. Plus, another idea or theory was that the people who are not on the front lines had more exposure to media and media fear mongering versus real experience. And so the fear mongering was far worse than the actual experience of what was happening. So this was a study that was done in China and published actually about, I think, maybe April of 2020. And so pretty quick publication of that study, finding out some really useful things about whether or not treating COVID creates trauma. So that is one example of why research is important. That's one way of connecting you to what we're going to do in this class. So the first concepts here are the ideas that psychology as a discipline uses the scientific method. This is a data-driven science. We look for data and we use data to help us understand the world. You are always using science. Whether or not you are aware of it yet, you are always using science as a consumer. And you might one day grow into becoming a producer. And so let's just talk a little bit about the difference between a consumer and a producer. And so you can understand how that works. If you're a consumer, you might have all kinds of questions that we use the scientific method to answer. And so one question might be like, is coconut oil good or bad for you? And in order to find that out, you have to define, well, what does it mean to be good for you or bad for you? And then you have to see what kind of coconut oil are you specifically talking about, because there are a number of kinds. Is it refined? Is it not refined? Is it virgin? Is it not virgin coconut oil? Whatever. So wanting to know, is coconut oil good or bad for you, is something that you need to ask the science on instead of asking probably your best friend, unless your best friend is really, really into science and you know that they know the data. Another question might be, is it better to exercise in the morning or in the afternoon? What it turns out is that it's really usually better to exercise in the afternoon because your body temperature is higher then and your muscles are much more flexible. So good to know, huh? Should you stretch before or after you exercise? Do you really need actually 8 glasses of water per day? That's actually not true. 8 glasses of water per day was a recommendation that happened that was not actually based in science, although it's still a pretty good idea. It's not based in science. Is it really a problem to only sleep 6 hours per night? I know as college students, it's really, really attractive, the idea of only being able to sleep 6 hours a night. And wouldn't it be great if you just functioned beautifully on that? But science does not support that. Sorry, science really tells us that you need 8 hours of sleep. How do you get a date? What's the science on getting a date? Or what's the science on depression? If your friend is depressed, what will really help them? What does science say about what will help them? And I'm sure that's a great example of an area where you can appreciate there are lots of people with advice, but how much of that advice actually works? And so when we look at deciding if something works or not, we're using the scientific method. If you're a producer, then you are producing the research. And so the consumers consume the research, the producers produce the research. And so here are a few examples. First example actually is one that I was involved in a long time ago when I was at Yale University. I worked in the School of Medicine doing research. And so we had a university based laboratory. We called ourselves the Center for the Advancement of Perioperative Health. And so we investigated all kinds of things that had to do with the perioperative environment. And so peri means kind of around. So the perioperative environment would be the environment around getting an operation. So it could be before, during, or after. And so we would look at a whole bunch of things like what kinds of medications work, how anxious kids handle it, whether if kids are more anxious, they have a worse time after the operation. How does recovery look? What about putting parents in the operating room? Does that help or hurt? What kinds of parents, etc. So you can see there's a lot of value in doing research and trying to disseminate it or let people know about the research that you've done so that they can make changes in what they do to help people, to be better at helping people, really. So you can have university-based labs, you can have a business-based lab, like a pharmaceutical company, for example. You can be on your own, doing your own small studies, you and your puppy, walking down different streets, etc., inventing your own. You could be in a government-based research center, like the CDC is one of those. There are lots of places where people do the research and they are the producers. And then their job is to tell other people that they've done the research and be able to disseminate it, which they do through primarily through articles. But you may find other ways where people share what findings they've had. So that's what it is to be a producer, and you see what it is to be a consumer. The next thing we'll talk about coming up is how do you know what is true? This is sort of a lifelong question. It's sort of a big deal. And so what happens is you see a lot of research out there. Certainly on the media, you'll see research if you read Reddit or Facebook or Instagram or any of those. You're going to see people saying, oh, this is true. Well, how do you know it's true? We're going to talk a little bit more about how you know it's true in our next video. So, to sum up, psychology is an empirical science. That means we use the scientific method, the empirical method, which means we look at data. We examine data to find out what works. Psychology is data driven. And you need to learn about how to use the scientific method so that you can be a good consumer. And in case you ever wanted to be a good producer, you could do that too. But it's really critical that you learn how to be a good consumer so that you can figure out is what you're seeing there something that is data driven, or is it something that somebody has just imagined that has no scientific support at all and you can reject it. All right. That's it for our first video. See you next time.